Leon Barrow had never wanted to live near a gated community, much less beside one that seemed to grow more artificial with each passing year. His land, nearly 11 acres of rough, uneven soil with scattered pines and a natural slope that held water through the dry season, wasn't picturesque in the suburban sense, but to him it was everything. The property had once belonged to an old family friend, a winemaker who had died in debt, and Leon had purchased it at a tax auction for little more than the cost of a used truck. It came with no guarantees, no comforts, and certainly no approval from the people who had built their identical beige houses along the edge of the development that pressed up against his eastern boundary. But what it did come with was solitude, autonomy, and the right to work the land without anyone else telling him what it should look like. The people in that nearby community, he refused to call them neighbors, saw his place differently. They saw wild grass instead of pasture in rotation, a half-restored barn instead of a renovation in progress, and an old Chevy truck that hadn't been washed since the last rainstorm instead of a reliable tool for hauling equipment. They saw disorder where Leon saw purpose. To them, his land was unkempt, improper, maybe even defiant. But Leon didn't lose sleep over appearances. He ran a tight, efficient homestead, maintained his own irrigation, managed livestock rotation schedules for his 24 sheep, grew hay, and had even begun planting a carefully curated plot of black walnut saplings he'd sourced from a retired botanist in Tennessee. That land wasn't just dirt. It was his plan, his project, and his way of staying grounded since Martha passed. He'd lost her 5 years ago. Brain aneurysm. Quick, cruel, and irreversible. Martha had been the only person who could get Leon to step away from his work long enough to appreciate what they were building together, even when it was nothing but dry land and a few hopeful sketches on grid paper. After she died, Leon didn't remodel the house or repaint the porch swing. He just kept going, hands in the soil, trying to finish what they had started. The orchard, the paddocks, the trails she wanted to build. All of it was there. Unfinished, maybe, but real. So when someone knocked on his gate with a clipboard and a customer service smile, asking him to consider aligning with the community landscaping vision, Leon said no. He didn't raise his voice, didn't curse, didn't even ask the man to leave. He simply closed the gate. At first, it was just letters. Typed notices with logos at the top and community concern headings. They were never addressed to him directly, just to property owner or landholder. He read the first few and discarded them. Then came the visits. Sometimes it was a woman in heels stepping delicately over the gravel. Sometimes a guy in khakis and mirrored sunglasses who never made eye contact. One even brought a bottle of wine as a peace offering, asking Leon to reconsider the visual impact of his compost piles. Leon said no again. Always no. His land. His rules. Karen Ridley was different. She hadn't introduced herself with fake politeness. She didn't bring wine or quote bylaws. She walked straight up to his fence and shouted across the pasture like she owned the place, like Leon was just some squatter holding out against progress. Her husband, she claimed, was an executive with a regional planning firm. Her kids were going to Stanford. Her backyard had won landscaping awards, whatever that meant. She had opinions about everything, drainage, pests, even the angle of his greenhouse windows, and she never asked permission to express them. She simply appeared one day, like a storm rolling in without warning, and began her campaign. Leon hadn't even known her name at first. She was just the one with the yappy dog, or the woman who stood by the property line yelling into her Bluetooth. But over time, he started getting mail with her name on it. Official complaints, petitions, a neighborhood action request claiming his brush piles were a fire hazard. Another alleging his irrigation system was contributing to regional mosquito spread. All of it was nonsense, of course. Leon had EPA-approved graywater systems, and his land had been inspected twice by the county since he'd installed them. But that didn't stop Karen from filing, nor did it stop the occasional passive-aggressive drive-by where her silver SUV would slow just enough for her to stare across the field like she was inspecting a crime scene. Still, Leon didn't react. He didn't believe in feeding trolls, and he sure as hell didn't believe in groveling for approval from people who'd paved over prairie land to build fake lakes and oversized playgrounds. He'd spent enough of his life working under contracts and clients who wanted things cheap, fast, and flawless. Now, the land was his client, and it didn't care about uniform fences or manicured hedges. It needed patience, consistency, and labor. That Leon had in spades. Until the morning he came back from a feed store run and found the gravel. It wasn't a small pile. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't even dumped politely on the side of his drive like someone meant to fix a pothole. No, this was a deliberate, targeted act. 5 tons of mixed gravel, masonry debris, and construction fill had been spread across the lower field, where Leon had been prepping for the walnut root grafts. It choked the soil, buried the irrigation lines, and compacted everything so deeply that he could already see the puddles forming. No tire tracks leading in, no markings on the debris. Just ruin. Leon walked the perimeter in silence. The sheep were penned at the far end watching him. He didn't curse, didn't yell. He just stood in the middle of the crushed field, staring down at the broken brick and concrete like it might tell him something. A bent nail. A bit of rebar. A splintered tile that looked suspiciously like the ones he'd seen discarded during the pool renovation over in the community clubhouse last fall. He didn't need proof to understand what this was. This wasn't negligence. It wasn't a mistake by a delivery driver. This was personal, intentional. Someone had decided that Leon's refusal to comply had become intolerable, and instead of trying again with legal threats or code enforcement, they went for the land itself. And that was when something shifted inside Leon. Not rage, not vengeance. Something quieter, a hardening. He knew the rules. He knew what his boundaries were. He'd built this life carefully, measuredly, and now someone had crossed into it, spit on the hours he'd put into that soil, and walked away thinking there'd be no answer. They thought silence meant surrender. But silence, Leon reminded himself as he walked back toward the house and reached for his old dust-covered notebook, the one with maps, elevations, receipts, was just the sound before the answer landed. And his answer was coming. Leon didn't sleep that night. Not because of panic, not even because of anger, but because his mind refused to quiet itself. Hours ticked by in silence as he sat at the kitchen table, poring over the parcel map of his land, cross-referencing it with printouts from the county assessor's office. He wasn't trying to play detective. He was trying to make sure he wasn't crazy. The boundaries were clear. The permits for irrigation were filed. The drainage plan had been signed off 4 years ago, and every improvement he'd made since was documented, photographed, and tucked in labeled envelopes. If someone had dumped 5 tons of debris on his land, it wasn't because of a clerical misunderstanding or routing error. It was a message, one sent by people who thought he either didn't have the will to fight back or didn't have the means. They miscalculated. Leon might not have the resources of a homeowner's board or a litigation firm, but he had time, tools, and, most importantly, the patience to outlast any of them. By sunrise, he'd already been down at the lower pasture, assessing the full extent of the damage. The gravel had been spread with enough precision to suggest equipment. Wide, leveled arcs that didn't match hand shovels or careless dumping. The layer was too even, the spread too deliberate. Leon squatted at the edge, fingers digging into the grit, noting how the sharp fragments of ceramic and cement had begun to bite into the shallow roots of the fescue. What disturbed him more than the immediate destruction was the complete disregard for the living system they had just suffocated. This wasn't just vandalism. It was annihilation, and whoever had orchestrated it had done so with the confidence of someone who believed they wouldn't be held accountable. He made the call mid-morning, after getting confirmation that the debris hadn't come from any road crew or infrastructure contractor. The county's Public Works Department politely confirmed they had no work orders for his road or surrounding easements. That meant it was a private operation, done off the books, likely by someone with access to machinery, materials, and just enough cowardice to do it under cover of night. He contacted the sheriff's office next, and the deputy on the phone said what Leon expected. He could file a report, but unless there was a witness or clear proof, like plates on a truck, footage from a camera, the case would go nowhere. When Leon mentioned the property cameras he had installed, the deputy perked up slightly, but the encouragement was lukewarm. "You can submit the video," the deputy said, "but if the truck had its plates covered or the image isn't clear, that limits what we can do. We can document the damage, but unless it's a clear ID, this'll end up in civil court, if anything." It was the kind of bureaucratic language Leon had heard too many times before. Careful, measured, and ultimately designed to say, "You're on your own." Still, he pulled the footage. One of his trail cameras, positioned halfway up the eastern slope, had picked up motion at around 2:13 a.m. A large flatbed with side panels, no markings, and high-mounted rear lights crawled down the narrow path between the property line and the back trail. Headlights off. Infrared blur caught only shapes. A driver and a second figure standing on the edge of the load bed, holding what looked like a rake or spreader. The truck had its plates visibly obscured, a black rectangle where numbers should have been. Whoever had done this, they'd come prepared. No accidental delivery truck stumbled through a side trail in the middle of the night with 2 men and a concealed plate. This had been planned. Leon submitted the video to the sheriff's office with the report, knowing full well it would end up in a folder somewhere labeled pending. Still, he followed procedure. He always followed procedure, even when others didn't. What followed next surprised him. Within 24 hours of the report, he received a letter, hand-delivered and stuck to his gate with blue painter's tape. Clean, intentional, and unmistakably formal. No return address, just an embossed letterhead at the top. Community Standards Committee. No signature, no contact number. Just a single paragraph, tightly worded, cold, and professional. It stated that land stabilization efforts have been executed in accordance with the committee's Environmental Buffer Zone Mitigation Plan, and further requests for landscape exemption will be reviewed at the next closed session. Leon read the letter twice. Then a third time. He didn't need to guess who was behind it. The words, Environmental Buffer Zone, made his stomach tighten. He'd seen them before in one of Karen Ridley's earlier complaints, where she accused his compost pile of emitting particulate matter that could compromise the adjacent community gardens. The complaint had gone nowhere then, but now, it seemed, someone had weaponized that language into policy. Closed session, reviewed, executed. The phrasing was surgical, just sterile enough to mask intent, just vague enough to imply legal defensibility. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. No law authorized private residents to dump construction waste on agricultural land. No buffer zone mitigation plan gave a neighborhood committee jurisdiction over a property they had no title to. But this wasn't about legality. This was about precedent. If they got away with this once, they'd do it again. Maybe not with gravel next time, maybe with fencing, easement claims, or manipulated zoning requests. The method would change. The intent wouldn't. Leon wasn't going to court. Not yet. He wasn't going to send angry emails or make threats on social media like some hysterical homeowner ranting about injustice. What he needed wasn't noise. It was clarity and consequence. He returned to the field, took measurements, and estimated volume. It was almost 6 tons, not 5. He noted the composition, took soil samples to test for contamination, and filed an anonymous tip with the Environmental Review Office. Not because he expected them to act, but because it put a timestamp on the dumping. If this ever reached litigation, he'd need more than his word and blurry video. Then he rented the loader. Not the biggest one. He didn't want to attract attention. Just enough horsepower to lift and carry with precision. He worked through the evening, starting at the far end of the field and scooping the gravel in careful arcs, dragging the blade just above the topsoil to avoid pulling more dirt than needed. He worked slowly, methodically, keeping the headlights off and using the full moon to guide his path. By midnight, the bucket was loaded with the first ton. By 3 a.m., he had moved half of the debris, now resting in a neat pile behind the far barn. At dawn, he parked the loader under the lean-to, covered it with a tarp, and waited. What came next wasn't a decision made out of temper. It was a strategic response. They had chosen to violate his space without notice, without evidence of jurisdiction, and without accountability. So he would do the opposite. He would return their gift. Not with vengeance, but with precision. He mapped the entry route. The service gate to the community center was left unlocked at night. He had seen maintenance trucks come and go during early hours more than once. The access road curved around the clubhouse and led directly to the pool area, which was enclosed by nothing more than a 6-foot privacy fence and a keypad entry system, one that maintenance often left propped open during cleaning hours. Leon didn't need to break in. He needed to arrive unnoticed, do his work, and leave before anyone stirred. And that's exactly what he did. 3 nights later, at 2:47 a.m., Leon rolled through the access road with the loader, the pile of mixed gravel balanced evenly in the front bucket. He maneuvered past the fence, onto the concrete patio, and gently tipped the debris across the tightly stretched vinyl pool cover. The material bowed, groaned, then held. A grotesque new island formed in the center. Crushed concrete, glass, and twisted rebar settled into a mound like a burial site. He backed away slowly, lowered the bucket to brush any spill from the patio edge, and rolled back toward the gate, locking it behind him as he exited. He didn't leave a note. He didn't take credit. He didn't say a word. By morning, the clubhouse parking lot was full of sedans and contractors. Leon sipped his coffee from the porch and listened to the distant commotion. Shouting, phone calls, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to figure out how 5 tons of gravel had been deposited on a community pool in the dead of night. They would know it was him. Of course they would. But what mattered now wasn't denial or proof. What mattered was balance. They came onto his land with machines and silence. He answered with the same. The days that followed the pool incident were quiet, almost suspiciously so. Leon half expected sirens the next morning, or a deputy's cruiser idling by the front gate with an officer stepping out, slow and cautious, asking if he'd like to talk about last night. But there was nothing. No knocks on the door. No letters. No accusations. Instead, the neighborhood on the other side of the fence fell into a stunned hush. It was the kind of silence that doesn't follow peace. It follows confusion, after something so brazen and calculated that no one knows what the first move should be. For once, Karen Ridley didn't appear at the fence to deliver complaints through gritted teeth or rehearsed smiles. Her pristine white SUV didn't roll slowly past his driveway with the window half down, pretending to check mail while clearly trying to gather information. She was gone, or at least keeping her distance. That, more than anything, confirmed to Leon what he already knew. She was responsible, or at the very least, complicit. But if the silence was their first answer, their second came 3 days later, quiet in its arrival, but sharp in its intent. Leon had driven into town early to pick up supplies, and when he returned mid-morning, he found something that made his stomach twist. A chain, padlocked and looped tightly through both gates at the end of his access road. It wasn't just a deterrent, it was industrial. A heavy steel security chain with a weather-sealed lock that looked military-grade. No tag, no note. Just there, suddenly, as if it had always belonged. His first thought was that some utility crew had made a mistake. His second thought, which settled like a brick in his chest, was that someone had decided to escalate. Leon didn't cut the chain. Not yet. He took photos, walked the perimeter, checked the easement path that wrapped behind the utility corridor, and found it clear. No locks there, at least not yet. That was telling. The main gate was blocked, but the alternate entry hadn't been touched. It wasn't about keeping him in or out. It was about showing power, creating disruption, testing his boundaries again, but this time wrapped in just enough ambiguity that if he reacted too harshly, he'd be labeled the aggressor. He knew that tactic. It was manipulation disguised as caution, pressure disguised as concern. It was the same playbook he'd seen in corporate negotiations years ago, when rival contractors would maneuver permits or deliveries just far enough out of spec to cause harm, but not enough to be blamed directly. He called the county office again. They hadn't ordered any closures. He asked about easement restrictions, gate modifications, chain installations, nothing. No permits filed. The land was still his. The road, though gravel and rural, was still legally his access. That meant this act was illegal. Trespass, obstruction. But when he called the sheriff's office, the voice on the other end sounded weary, uninterested. "It's probably a misunderstanding," the deputy said. "Someone trying to make a point. You could just remove the chain and be done with it. That'd save everyone some paperwork." Leon didn't bother arguing. Instead, he logged the incident, took video as he removed the chain, using bolt cutters this time, and archived everything. Then he bought a new camera system, one with plate recognition and audio pickup, and installed it above the main gate that same night. They wanted to control access? Fine. He'd control the record. Every vehicle, every face, every inch of that approach would now be documented. Let them try again. But it didn't end there. The next morning, he noticed something else. Subtle at first, easy to dismiss. A new sign had been staked at the far edge of the property, just outside his fence line, near the footpath where neighborhood joggers sometimes passed through. It read, in neat blue lettering, "Private area, land management in progress. Unauthorized entry may violate city code." It wasn't on his land, but it was close enough to confuse. Close enough to suggest, perhaps to anyone unfamiliar with the actual boundary lines, that the area was under jurisdictional review or being managed by someone other than the rightful owner. Leon pulled the sign from the ground and threw it into the shed. 2 days later, another appeared. Different wording, same style. This one said, "Under review, redevelopment planning zone." Then a third, "Soil stabilization testing site." Whoever was posting these signs had access to municipal phrasing, likely a printer with templates from urban planning boards. None of it was official, but it was close enough to cause doubt. To the public, it made Leon's land look like disputed territory. This, more than the dumping or the chain, disturbed him. It wasn't just interference anymore. It was psychological. Reputation. Positioning. It suggested someone was laying groundwork for a formal move, the kind of maneuver that usually ended in survey disputes, rezoning, or aggressive code enforcement. And Leon wasn't wrong, because the following week he received a formal notice from the Office of Community Infrastructure and Development. A red envelope, stamped with urgency, warning him that a concerned civic party had filed a request for environmental inspection. The reason? Improper use of water infrastructure leading to potential contamination of downstream systems. Leon laughed when he read it, out loud, bitter, exhausted, but not surprised. It was an escalation tactic, a paper attack meant to stall, wear down, and maybe bankrupt. The kind of game you play when you can't win directly, so you suffocate your target with bureaucracy until they give in or go under. The worst part? It worked, at least on the surface, because until the inspection was completed, he couldn't plant, couldn't build. Any changes to soil or drainage would be considered tampering with evidence. But Leon didn't just sit still. He called his hydrologist, the same man who'd helped him design the original irrigation plan, and asked him to come out again. This time, for a full independent review. He didn't need to disprove the complaint. He needed to build a better one. One with data, timestamps, verifiable metrics. He paid out of pocket. Didn't complain. Just booked the inspection, walked the fields with the hydrologist, and let him test everything. The results, when they came back, were what he expected. No violations, no signs of runoff, no evidence of harm. But it took 9 days to get the report. 9 days of waiting, unable to continue work while the land sat exposed and drying. During that time, Leon noticed new behavior from his neighbors. Cars lingered longer at the stop signs near his gate. Joggers suddenly doubled back when they saw him working outside. A drone hovered once, just past sunset, holding position above the greenhouse for nearly 3 full minutes before it drifted off without a sound. It wasn't paranoia. It was surveillance, amateur and obvious, but surveillance nonetheless. Someone wanted to track his movements, see what he'd do next, maybe even provoke a misstep. But Leon gave them nothing. No outburst, no confrontation, just the steady, silent continuation of his work. He repaired the damaged field in sections, removed what gravel he could, repurposed what was uncontaminated to fortify his internal roads, and spread fresh soil across the dead zones. He didn't replant yet. Too soon, too risky with the complaints active. But he made it clear the land was being cared for, maintained, watched. Then came the letter that changed everything. It wasn't from the community. It wasn't from the city. It came from a private firm, Land Asset Reclamation and Solutions. The letter claimed they were working in partnership with regional stakeholders to acquire parcels of underutilized land for ecological conversion and tax incentive redevelopment. They offered him a buyout, a generous one, more than fair on paper. But buried in the fine print was the real motive. The purchase would consolidate the eastern stretch of land, including his property, into a single conservation easement, managed by the very neighborhood that had been harassing him. They weren't trying to scare him off. They were trying to fold him in, strip the title, absorb the land, and erase the problem altogether. Leon folded the letter slowly, placed it in the burn barrel behind the barn, and lit it with a match. He didn't watch it burn. He turned away and walked back to the field, because now he understood. This wasn't about aesthetics, or noise, or grass height. It was about control. And they had just declared war. Leon knew the offer was the pivot point. Everything before it had been probing, small-scale intimidation, and procedural harassment. Now they were showing their real hand. They wanted the land, wanted him gone, but not with confrontation. They wanted him folded into paperwork, bought out with language that made it sound like a civic opportunity. There was nothing ecological or altruistic about it. It was consolidation. Control disguised as green policy. Leon didn't waste time answering. He didn't draft a rebuttal or contact the firm to negotiate. He wasn't for sale. What he needed now wasn't just resistance. He needed leverage. The hydrologist report, delivered just days earlier, became his foundation. It was clean, thorough, and irrefutable. He filed a copy with the county, accompanied by a statement of compliance and request for public record filing. That made it official, traceable, something they couldn't later erase or discredit. Then he contacted a land use attorney, not to sue, not yet, but to make sure everything he had was secured, timed, and documented. He knew the kind of opponent he was facing now. Not a group of angry neighbors or HOA officers playing property police, but something coordinated, likely funded, and familiar with how to win not by force but by process. The lawyer, recommended through a friend in town who had fought his own zoning battle years ago, was sharp, blunt, and uninterested in theater. She read through the materials, scanned the offer from Land Asset Reclamation, and made one simple suggestion. Make yourself visible, but untouchable. They're building a case against you. Small things stacked over time, she said. You don't fight that head on. You make them waste energy, expose themselves, and overplay. So Leon did exactly that. He refiled his agricultural designation request, something he hadn't done since he first acquired the property, and expanded it to include experimental growth under the Department of Natural Resources. That triggered a second level of inspection, this time from a state agency. When the inspector arrived, a young, no-nonsense woman with work boots and a clipboard, she didn't ask loaded questions. She checked irrigation spacing, native vegetation ratios, erosion buffers. Leon answered calmly, clearly, with documentation. The visit lasted 2 hours. At the end, she nodded and said, "You're in compliance. If they try to zone you as residential, they're going to hit a wall." That report would take another 10 days to process. In the meantime, Leon kept working, quietly, deliberately. He repaired one of the damaged irrigation trenches, rotating in native rye instead of alfalfa, giving the land time to breathe. He replaced a section of fencing on the eastern boundary with a new line of cedar posts, sturdy, visible, unmistakably inside his property. He installed 2 new motion sensor cameras, one of them disguised as a birdhouse near the approach trail. He wasn't trying to catch anyone anymore. He was broadcasting. "I see you. You're not anonymous." The silence didn't last long. 4 days after the state inspection, someone dumped a wheelbarrow load of sharp gravel and glass along the trail used by his sheep. Not a large pile, but deliberate, hidden just under loose straw, designed to cause harm. One ewe tore her hoof open. Leon found her limping, blood smeared across the gate panel. It was the first time he considered actual violence, the kind that rises up from the gut and doesn't ask for permission. He didn't act on it. He stitched the animal's wound, cleaned the blood, and filed another report, this one with photos, time-stamped video, and a signed statement from the vet. That was the moment his attorney changed tactics. She drafted a formal complaint for malicious interference with agricultural operations and submitted it to the State Agriculture Board. At the same time, she sent letters to the Community Association, to the reclamation firm, and to the Municipal Zoning Office. Each letter was simple, factual, and loaded with consequence. She wasn't accusing. She was putting them on record. If anything else happened, another sign, another dumping, another false report, they would be named in a coordinated action with the backing of state-level oversight. And then something shifted. A week passed with no incidents, no signs, no drones, no locks. The pool remained closed. The gravel had not been replaced. The clubhouse bulletin board had been cleared of event flyers and meeting notices. Even Karen's SUV stayed parked behind her garage as though she'd vanished entirely from the chessboard. Leon didn't relax. He knew what was happening. They were regrouping. But something unexpected came instead. A letter, handwritten, delivered in a plain white envelope, placed inside his mailbox rather than affixed to the gate. It was from someone within the community. A resident. Not Karen, not a board member, just a neighbor. The letter was short. It said, "I don't agree with what they've been doing. I thought it was just about the property looking out of place. I didn't know they were going this far. If you need a statement, I'll give one. I don't want to be part of this anymore." No name. But the handwriting was careful, practiced. Someone older, someone who'd likely sat in meetings, heard plans, and watched them spin out of control. Leon didn't reply. Not yet, but he scanned the note and saved a copy with the rest of his documents. Because what he had now was more than evidence. He had a fracture, and that was how this would unravel. From inside, it would have been easy for Leon to assume the worst had passed. The lull, the sudden quiet, the lack of movement from the other side of the boundary. Anyone unfamiliar with how pressure works would have mistaken it for surrender. But Leon had been around long enough to recognize the difference between retreat and recalibration. They hadn't stopped because they lost. They had stopped because they needed to regroup, redraw the lines, and prepare a new front that wouldn't be as visible, wouldn't be as easily exposed by camera footage or legal filings. The passive tactics had failed, so now they would pivot, not with confrontation, but with something more corrosive. Slow erosion of legitimacy, of ownership, of his right to exist where he wasn't wanted. That was always the real battle. It began with subtle gestures that weren't directly threatening but carried a weight that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The local waste pickup service, which Leon had paid quarterly for years without interruption, suddenly stopped collecting from his bin. He called, only to be told that his address had been removed from the route due to municipal jurisdiction changes. When he asked for documentation, they forwarded him to a generic email that bounced back an auto response. He drove into town to meet with someone in person, and the woman behind the desk, barely 20 and clearly not in charge of anything, said the computer showed his property now fell under a transition zone, flagged for pending reassignment to regional services. It was a term that didn't exist in any of the zoning maps Leon had reviewed, nor did it appear on the county's website. But there it was, on her screen, in a shade of light gray with no explanation. That same week, his mail began arriving irregularly. Days would pass with nothing. Then it would appear in the clumps, sometimes misdelivered or marked address verification required. When he asked his local post office, they said his mailbox had been flagged for non-conforming standards. They handed him a printout of regulations, highlighting a rule about visibility from the main road, a road that hadn't changed in 20 years and had never been an issue before. His box had been standing there untouched since Martha painted it. By the end of the month, 2 inspections had been scheduled on his land without his knowledge. One from code enforcement, citing visible debris and mechanical hazard exposure, and the other from a fire marshal's assistant who claimed to be responding to community concern over brush density and ignition risk. Both arrived unannounced, both entered without direct permission, and both were confused when Leon presented his official agricultural exemption status, state inspection clearance, and the fresh compliance letter from the Department of Natural Resources. They left quickly, one apologizing under his breath. But it didn't matter. The message had been delivered. The game had escalated from subtle interference to outright manufactured concern, masked behind official uniforms and institutional vagueness. And yet, what they didn't seem to understand, or had underestimated, was Leon's ability to absorb. His resilience wasn't in aggression. It was in patience, preparation, and an almost surgical ability to respond only when necessary, and only in ways that left no blood in the water. He didn't call press. He didn't rant online. He called his attorney again, updated her on the visits, and they filed a formal inquiry into unauthorized inspections. That paper trail, however tedious, now carried weight. The next push was unexpected, and it didn't come through the gate. It came through people. Over the course of 3 weeks, Leon received a series of visitors, people he hadn't seen before. Some were polite, some evasive, all curious. A young couple claiming to be looking at land in the area, asking if his property might be for sale. A middle-aged man who said he was researching local agricultural practices and wanted to walk the orchard to see graft alignment. An older woman who insisted she had family ties to the region and just wanted to stand on the ridge one last time. Leon allowed none of them past the fence. They were scouts, sent to test boundaries, extract information, maybe even provoke him. Each one was followed up within 48 hours by either an anonymous complaint or a service interruption. But then, as he anticipated the next move, came the one thing he didn't expect. His banking institution called. A flagged transaction. A hold placed on an incoming transfer from one of his contracted produce buyers. When Leon called for clarification, the bank's compliance officer said that the property's status had been questioned during a routine external audit. It had triggered an internal review of asset risk associated with agricultural income. Again, no direct accusation, but a flag, a procedural delay. That delay cost him 2 weeks of cash flow, 2 weeks of stalled payments to suppliers and seasonal workers. Not enough to ruin him, but enough to apply pressure. He sat on the porch that night, boots still muddy, arms heavy with fatigue not from labor but from relentless anticipation. And as he looked over the ridgeline toward the distant glow of the gated community's artificial lights, he realized they were using a tactic he had once described to a friend during his years on government contracts: exhaustion warfare. Not destruction, but suffocation. Not a battle to win in a day, but a campaign designed to outlast the will to fight. But what they didn't factor in was that Leon had already been through the worst. He'd buried a wife. He'd watched a dream fall apart and rebuilt it with his own hands. He'd lost time, money, and sleep, but never ground. Not the kind that mattered. So he adjusted. He brought in a second lawyer, one specializing in land defense and commercial interference. Not because he wanted to escalate into court immediately, but because he needed someone who could take over the daily resistance. Someone who could track the paper, respond to the accusations, handle the phone calls and letters while Leon did what he needed to do. Maintain the land, protect the boundary, and stay sharp. And that's when the tipping point came. Not through another attack, but from an internal rupture. The anonymous letter he had received weeks ago had come from someone deeper in the community than he realized, because that person, whoever they were, began leaving more. Not letters now, but documents, meeting minutes, screenshots of internal communications, even a voice recording of a closed meeting where Karen Ridley described Leon's land as a hole in our landscape, and detailed plans to strategically convert the property into a managed easement zone by attrition or acquisition. The words were direct. Ruthless. She spoke with confidence, listing contacts in zoning, connections in municipal planning, even a proposed timeline for finalization of the transition process. It was, for Leon, the turning point, not emotionally, but tactically. Now he had something real. Not just implication, not just suspicion, but proof of intent, coordination, and malice. He didn't rush. He gathered. He reviewed. He shared it quietly with his legal team. Together, they constructed a protective filing. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but a formal notification to all involved parties that they were in possession of documented evidence of coordinated interference, libel, and land use manipulation. The document outlined their knowledge of the pattern, identified specific actors, and signaled the preparation of injunctive relief. The response was almost immediate. Karen Ridley, who had not been seen publicly in weeks, resigned from her position as head of the Neighborhood Development Committee. No announcement, no explanation. Just a line in a newsletter stating she was stepping back due to health and family commitments. Her name vanished from the community bulletin board, the website, and the public documents. A week later, 2 of the most aggressive board members also resigned. By the end of the month, the group that had once sent him letters weekly ceased all communication. Leon didn't celebrate. He didn't tell anyone. He simply stood at the edge of his field one morning, watching the frost lift off the grass, and felt, for the first time in months, stillness. Because the second escalation hadn't failed by being met with equal force. It had collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. And now, finally, they were the ones unsure of who was watching whom. By the time the leaves began to turn and the days shortened into that dry, golden stretch between summer and true fall, Leon had already made peace with the fact that the war would never end cleanly. There wouldn't be a single verdict, a courtroom victory, or a moment where someone from the other side would knock on his door and say, "You were right." That wasn't how these battles were fought, not in neighborhoods, not on land, and certainly not where money met ego. But what had changed was the dynamic. He was no longer reacting. He was no longer absorbing. Now they were the ones calculating every move, second-guessing who else might be watching, listening, documenting. And that shift, subtle but complete, changed everything. With Karen Ridley gone, the machine she had operated slowed, but it hadn't stopped. It couldn't. It had been built on the premise of order and uniformity, and Leon's presence, his stubborn, unyielding refusal to bend, remained a threat to that illusion. But without her at the helm, the coordination frayed. Where once there had been seamless messaging, weekly memos, orchestrated complaints, there was now dissonance. One faction wanted to continue the pressure. Another feared exposure. A third wanted to cut their losses and pretend none of it had happened. It was the perfect storm of fear, fatigue, and fragile pride, and Leon knew from experience that this kind of fracture rarely went quietly. Then came the audit. An anonymous whistleblower, likely the same person who had been feeding Leon materials, filed a formal complaint with the city's Ethics Commission. The target, the neighborhood association's financial practices, particularly their discretionary funds and environmental project budgets. The claim was detailed, supported by meeting records and contractor invoices. The focus wasn't Leon directly, it was broader, but the overlap was undeniable. One of the projects under scrutiny was labeled Soil Mitigation Initiative, Perimeter Buffer Enhancement, with a date that matched the week the gravel had been dumped on Leon's land. That audit became a catalyst. City officials began making inquiries. Inspectors returned, not to his property this time, but to the clubhouse, the common areas, the green zones where money had allegedly been spent but where no clear improvements could be found. One crew brought ground radar equipment. Another arrived with legal pads, snapping photos of fencing, irrigation rigs, even signage placement. And the members of the board, those who had survived the earlier resignations, were suddenly nowhere to be seen. Emails went unanswered. Voicemail boxes filled. Meetings were canceled, pending internal review. For Leon, it was not a moment of triumph, but of necessary silence. He kept to his routine. Up before sunrise, working the orchard, maintaining the drainage paths, logging notes for the seasonal rotation. But the land felt different now. Not heavier, not darker, but quieter, as though the pressure pressing down on the boundary lines had lifted just slightly. He could breathe without bracing for impact. And in that breath, in that clarity, he made the final move. He contacted the Agricultural Department's Conservation Branch and submitted an application to designate a portion of his land as a protected development buffer, an easement that, if approved, would classify his eastern slope as a non-disturbable. Native habitat, immune to any form of redevelopment or annexation for 30 years. It wouldn't stop all interference, but it would make future acquisitions bureaucratically impossible without full state review. It was a move not of retaliation, but preservation. Defensive, permanent, and legally shielded. The inspection for that process was thorough, more thorough than any he'd had before. Botanists, soil experts, even a biologist specializing in riparian habitats walked his land, marking species, identifying runoff paths, checking for migratory traces. Leon walked with them, answering questions, sharing his logs, explaining how he'd rotated cover crops to maintain nitrogen balance. They weren't there to find a reason to deny him. They were there to verify his claim. When the lead inspector asked, "Do you have any objections from adjacent landowners?" Leon simply said, "Not anymore." 3 weeks later, the approval came through. It was a short letter, but a powerful one. His eastern perimeter, the exact stretch that bordered the community's managed trail system and buffer path, was now state-protected. No construction, no clearing, no modification. Any attempt to intervene without clearance would carry both civil and environmental penalties. Leon posted a copy on the interior of his barn, right next to the folded field map Martha had drawn years ago, where they had planned out where the garden would go and how the orchard would be spaced. He looked at it not as a trophy, but as a shield. One earned, one that couldn't be taken easily. But the board, desperate to reassert control, made one last move. A public relations campaign. A newsletter went out to every resident, written in the voice of unity, progress, and community vision. It spoke vaguely of recent land use conversations, praised the flexibility of property owners working in harmony, and referenced a new spirit of ecological stewardship. There was no mention of Leon, no apology, no admission. Just repackaged retreat, spun as collective victory. Leon didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because the same week the newsletter arrived, a city official visited his land. Not with a clipboard, but with a handshake. They thanked him for his cooperation during the audit, for maintaining accurate records, for hosting the inspectors without incident. And then they said something that surprised him. This kind of fight usually gets nasty. You managed to win it without burning the field down. He didn't correct them, because they didn't know how close the field had come to fire. They didn't know about the night he'd held the bolt cutters like a weapon. They didn't know about the dog that had limped in pain for days because of what someone had buried in the straw. They didn't know about the silent war fought not with fists, but with filings, strategy, and a level of control most men would have surrendered long before the third letter arrived. But Leon knew. He knew every step, every escalation, every move made in shadow, and everyone returned in silence. And now, for the first time in almost a year, he stood in the center of his land and felt that rarest of sensations. Stillness without fragility. It wasn't peace, but it was power. The kind that doesn't come from noise, but from endurance. From outlasting the storm not by running from it, but by refusing to bow. The frost came earlier that year. The nights turned sharp before the leaves had fully fallen, and for the first time in months the mornings were silent in the way Leon remembered from the first years on the land. There were no meetings across the fence line, no construction noise drifting in from the east, no slow-driving SUVs pausing to inspect his property from behind tinted windows. The tension that had once hung between his boundary and the neighboring homes like a tripwire had dissolved. Not vanished entirely, but pulled back into the earth like a coiled root, waiting for something worth rising again. But Leon wasn't waiting anymore. The war had been fought. The line had been drawn, not just in paperwork and boundary markers, but in resolve. What remained now was the quiet aftermath, the reshuffling of routines, the reclaiming of time, the deliberate work of making the land feel whole again. He didn't tell anyone about the letter he received in mid-October. It was postmarked from out of state, handwritten and unsigned. Just a brief note, neat cursive, folded twice and sealed without any flourish. It read simply, "I didn't know what it would become. I thought it was about standards. I never wanted it to get that ugly. You held the line. You did what most of us were too afraid to do." There was no return address, no name, but Leon knew. The script matched the first letter that had arrived anonymously months earlier, the one that cracked the shell of secrecy inside the opposing camp. Whoever had sent it hadn't left to save him. They'd left to save themselves. But even that, in the end, had value. The community across the boundary shifted subtly. Some homes sold, quiet ones, no listings on local platforms, just discreet signs that vanished within days. The board restructured, dissolved certain committees, renamed others. Neighborhood aesthetic integrity became Open Spaces Advisory. The trails remained closed longer than expected due to safety concerns, though Leon suspected it had less to do with actual safety and more to do with appearances. One morning, he noticed a new family moving into the Ridley home. A young couple, 2 boys, no lawn decorations. They didn't wave, didn't linger. Just moved in, unceremoniously like any other relocation. Leon didn't wave back. Not out of hostility, but because the boundary, once violated, was no longer casual. It was now permanent, formal, quietly understood. Life returned to rhythm, not in the way of a storybook victory, but in the way old bones reset after a long break. Things moved slower, but cleaner. He replanted the eastern section, not for yield, but for soil health. Native grasses, clover, low-maintenance cover. He cleared the gravel path by hand, a little each week, no longer racing against someone else's clock. The sheep returned to graze. The irrigation lines held. No new letters came, no inspections, no flyers tucked under windshield wipers. The silence wasn't just the absence of hostility, it was respect, earned through attrition. In late November, the attorney called. The final review from the state was in. His designation had been entered into public registry, and no challenges had been filed. The land, at least the part that mattered most, was now secured under multi-decade protection. The buffer zone could no longer be claimed, converted, or zoned without full state override. It wasn't just a technicality. It was a fortress in paper, exactly the kind of defense people like Karen Ridley could never tear down with charm or connection. Leon didn't celebrate. He didn't even acknowledge it aloud. He just walked the edge of the buffer one morning, boots leaving faint tracks in the frost, and stood at the highest point of the slope where the orchard met the clearing. The cold air cut through his coat, and the sky above him was wide and clean, the kind of blue that doesn't last beyond early morning. From that ridge he could see the full length of his land, touched, altered, bruised, but unbroken. Not in the way it looked, but in the way it stood. He didn't feel pride. He felt weight. The weight of every decision, every letter he hadn't sent, every confrontation he had let die in silence. This victory wasn't about being stronger. It was about being stubborn, about holding the line, even when